January 13th, 1979, Queens, New York. A cold winter morning where nothing looked unusual, nothing felt dangerous, and nothing in the air suggested that history was about to close one of its most violent chapters. Inside a quiet residential house, a man walked forward believing he was stepping into the most important moment of his life, a moment he had waited years for, a moment that in his mind would finally elevate him from being an associate, a trigger man, a loyal soldier, into something far more powerful inside the world he worshipped, a made man in the mafia. His name was Thomas Two-Gun Tommy DeSimone, and in that moment, as he adjusted his jacket and moved through that doorway, he had no idea that the path ahead was not promotion, not respect, not honor, but an execution already decided long before he arrived. The silence inside the house was not normal silence. It was controlled silence, the kind that exists when everyone inside already knows why they are there. But Tommy didn't know that. He believed he was being rewarded for years of violence, years of loyalty, years of doing what others were too afraid to do. What he didn't understand was that in the mafia world, rewards are never guaranteed, but consequences always are. And Tommy had accumulated too many consequences to ever walk away clean. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to understand who Tommy DeSimone really was. He was not just another street-level thug or background character in someone else's story. Tommy was the kind of man even hardened criminals watched carefully because his violence wasn't just functional, it was instinctive. He didn't hesitate, he didn't question, and he didn't calculate morality. In the world he lived in, hesitation meant death, but Tommy had gone far beyond survival instinct. He had become someone who acted before thought, and that made him both valuable and dangerous at the same time. He worked under the network connected to Jimmy Burke and the Lucchese-associated crew operating out of Queens, a group built not on traditional mafia structure, but on profit, fear, and opportunity. They hijacked trucks, stole shipments, ran robberies, and erased problems with the same efficiency a business would erase debt. To them, Tommy was not a liability in the beginning. He was an asset, a weapon that didn't need instruction. But in the mafia, every weapon eventually becomes a risk if it is not controlled, and Tommy was never fully controllable. The turning point that sealed his fate was not a single mistake, but a collection of actions that crossed an invisible line that no one in that world was allowed to cross. Years earlier, Tommy had been involved in one of the most infamous killings in organized crime history, the murder of Billy Batts, a made man associated with the Gambino family. That killing was not just violence. It was a violation of hierarchy itself. In mafia structure, made men were untouchable without approval from the highest level. Killing one without permission didn't just create enemies. It created a permanent debt written in blood. And debts like that are never forgotten. For a short time after that murder, life continued as if nothing had changed. That is the strange reality of organized crime. The world doesn't collapse immediately after betrayal or violence. Instead, it continues in silence. But the silence is not peace, it is preparation. Behind closed doors, conversations were happening between powerful families, between men who understood that reacting too early creates chaos, but reacting too late creates weakness. The Gambino family did not move immediately. They observed, they tracked, and they waited. And Tommy, living in his own sense of invincibility, interpreted that silence as survival. But survival in that world is never permanent unless it is protected by power, and Tommy did not have that level of protection. As years passed, Tommy continued operating within the same violent ecosystem, still aligned with Burke's crew, still involved in crimes that generated millions, still playing the role of enforcer whenever something needed to disappear permanently. But something had shifted beneath the surface. The mafia is not just about violence, it is about structure. And Tommy had become a structural problem. Too unpredictable, too reckless, too exposed. And worse than that, he was someone who knew too much. He had witnessed too many internal operations, too many high-value crimes, too many moments that could collapse entire networks if ever spoken out loud. In that world, knowledge is not power, it is liability. And liabilities are removed when they become too risky. By the time January 1979 arrived, decisions had already been made. Not emotional decisions, not impulsive decisions, but calculated ones. The kind of decisions that happen in rooms where nobody raises their voice, because they don't need to. Tommy was told he was being called for a meeting, but this meeting was different. It carried weight, purpose, finality. And Tommy, blinded by ambition and the belief that loyalty eventually gets rewarded, accepted it without hesitation. He believed this was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment where everything he had done would finally be validated by induction into the mafia as a made man. That belief is what carried him through the door that morning. The belief that his past would be forgiven and his future secured. But inside that house, reality was already waiting for him, and reality in that world does not negotiate. Inside that house in Queens, the atmosphere was not loud, it was not chaotic, and it was not emotional. It was controlled, almost surgical, as if every person inside already understood the purpose of the moment, except the man who had just walked in. Thomas, Two-Gun Tommy. DeSimone stood there unaware that the story he believed he was stepping in had already been written without him. He still carried the mindset of reward, of recognition, of elevation. In his world, violence had always led to advancement, loyalty had always led to protection, and time had always justified his actions. But what Tommy never fully understood was that in organized crime, time does not erase consequences. It only delays them until they become convenient. The decision to remove Tommy was not something that happened in anger or in reaction to a single event. It was the result of years of accumulated risk. In the mafia world, men are not judged only by what they do, but by what they represent over time. Tommy represented instability. He represented exposure. He represented a walking archive of crimes that no one could afford to have spoken out loud. Every robbery he participated in, every murder he witnessed, every operation he helped execute under Jimmy Burke's network added another layer of liability. And in that world, liability is never allowed to mature into danger. There is a misconception that organized crime operates on emotion, on revenge, on personal loyalty. But the deeper truth is far colder. Decisions are made based on balance sheets of risk and value. Tommy had stopped being valuable in the long-term equation. His usefulness as an enforcer had been replaced by something more dangerous, his unpredictability. He was no longer the control weapon he once appeared to be. He was now a variable that could not be calculated. And in systems built on control, unpredictability is treated as a threat to survival. When Tommy entered that house, he believed he was entering a promotion meeting. That belief itself shows how deeply he misunderstood the system he served. The mafia does not promote men in emotional ceremonies the way corporations do. It absorbs, tests, evaluates, and when necessary, eliminates. A made man status is not something given lightly, and in Tommy's case, it was never something he was going to receive. The idea had been allowed to circulate only as a tool, a psychological illusion that kept him moving forward, kept him loyal, kept him available when needed. But illusions in that world always expire. The moment inside the house shifted without announcement. There was no speech, no confrontation, no dramatic build-up. That is what separates reality from cinema. In movies, violence is preceded by dialogue. In reality, it is preceded by silence. A silence that tightens the room, compresses time, and removes hesitation. Tommy may not have understood it consciously, but his body likely registered it. The shift in posture, the lack of casual movement, the absence of normal conversation cues. These are the small signals that animals and experienced criminals both recognize, even before logic catches up. And then it happened. The first movement was not chaotic. It was direct, controlled force. Tommy was not given the dignity of argument or negotiation. There was no warning that could have changed the outcome because the outcome was already fixed. In that world, when a decision reaches execution stage, the process is simply the completion of what has already been agreed upon elsewhere. Tommy's strength, the same strength that had made him feared on the streets, the same aggression that had allowed him to dominate weaker men, suddenly became irrelevant. Inside that room, strength was not measured by physical power anymore, but by who had already decided the ending. The shots were not emotional. They were precise. Multiple impacts delivered in succession, designed not to send a message of rage, but to ensure finality. There was no hesitation in execution because hesitation increases risk, and risk is the one thing organized crime systems eliminate at all costs. Tommy's body collapsed into the reality that had been waiting for him from the moment he walked through that door. There was no speech delivered over him, no symbolic gesture of warning to others, no theatrical display. Because this was not meant to be seen as drama. It was meant to be seen as removal. What followed immediately after was not panic, but procedure. In these environments, even violent outcomes are processed like transactions. The human element is stripped away quickly because emotion interferes with efficiency. The body had to be handled. Evidence had to be controlled. Movement had to remain quiet and deliberate. Every action after the execution was about minimizing trace, minimizing exposure, and ensuring that what had just happened remained contained within that space. But beyond the physical act, what made Tommy's insignificant was not how he died, but why he was allowed to reach that point in the first place. Because by the time he was executed, his fate had already been justified internally within the system he belonged to. He was not removed because of sudden betrayal. He was removed because he had become a long-term structural risk that could no longer be ignored. That is the part the movie version never fully explains. Cinema often focuses on the moment of violence, but the real story exists in the months and years of quiet calculation that lead to it. Tommy DeSimone was not just a victim of a hit. He was a victim of a system that rewards usefulness and punishes exposure. In his mind, loyalty and violence had built his identity. But in the system he served, those same traits only mattered until they became inconvenient. And once inconvenience crosses a certain threshold, removal becomes inevitable. The irony of his situation is that Tommy spent his entire life believing he understood how the mafia worked. He believed it was about respect, fear, dominance, and loyalty. But what he never fully grasped was that beneath all of that, the foundation was always control. And control does not tolerate uncertainty. It does not tolerate loose ends. And it does not tolerate men who carry too many unanswered questions about too many unresolved crimes. By the time the shots were fired, Tommy was no longer being judged as a man. He was being processed as a problem that had reached expiration. And in that world, expiration is never delayed once it is decided. After the silence returned to that house in Queens, nothing inside it looked unusual from the outside. There were no signs that a decision had just been executed, no visible chaos spilling into the street, no dramatic aftermath that would suggest something irreversible had just taken place. And that is exactly how the world of organized crime operates when it reaches its most serious conclusions. The most important moments are never announced, never recorded publicly, and never witnessed in the way movies often suggest. They simply happen, and then the world continues as if nothing changed, even though everything has already shifted permanently beneath the surface. Thomas Two Gun Tommy DeSimone was gone, but the meaning of his death extended far beyond the man himself. In the structure of the mafia, no killing exists in isolation. Every execution is connected to a chain of decisions, past actions, and future consequences. Tommy's removal was not just about punishment, and it was not just about revenge for earlier crimes like the killing of Billy Batts. It was about control being reasserted over a situation that had become unstable for too long. The mafia does not operate like a system reacting to emotion. It operates like a system correcting imbalance. For years leading up to that moment, Tommy had existed in a dangerous space. He was useful enough to be kept alive, but risky enough to always remain under observation. He had participated in high-level robberies, witnessed internal violence, and been close to figures like Jimmy Burke who were themselves walking contradictions of loyalty and danger. The Lufthansa heist aftermath, the internal purges, the disappearances of associates, all of it created an environment where survival was never guaranteed by loyalty alone. Survival depended on whether or not you were still useful to the system that created you. Tommy's biggest problem was not just what he had done, but what he represented. He was a living link between multiple crimes, multiple operations, and multiple people who could not afford exposure. In organized crime, loose ends are not theoretical risks. They are future disasters waiting for the right moment to surface. And Tommy was one of those loose ends that had simply lived long enough to become unavoidable. The longer he remained alive, the more valuable his silence became, and the more dangerous his existence became. The irony of his story is that the same world that elevated him as an enforcer eventually treated him as a liability. That is the fundamental contradiction of the mafia structure. It builds men up based on their ability to commit violence, and then destroys them when that same violence creates exposure. There is no retirement plan, no exit strategy, no peaceful transition out of that life. There is only usefulness, and then there is removal. When Tommy was killed, it was not treated as a dramatic event inside that system. There was no public acknowledgement, no formal declaration, no symbolic closure. Because in that world, closure is not emotional, it is operational. Once a threat is eliminated, attention immediately shifts elsewhere. The system does not pause to reflect. It recalibrates. What makes Tommy DeSimone's story especially significant is how it contrasts with its cinematic portrayal. In films like Goodfellas, violence is often framed as impulsive, emotional, or triggered by disrespect. It gives audiences the impression that mob killings are reactions to personal insults or sudden rage. But the real structure underneath organized crime is far more methodical. Insults may trigger moments of violence at lower levels, but high-level eliminations are rarely about emotion. They are about long-term risk management. Tommy was not removed because of a single moment of disrespect or because of one isolated incident. He was removed because over time he became statistically unsustainable within the environment he operated in. Too many connections, too much knowledge, too many unresolved risks tied to his existence. In systems like that, once a man reaches that threshold, his outcome becomes predictable, even if the timing is not. There is also a deeper psychological layer to his story. Men like Tommy often believe they are protected by their reputation for violence. They assume that being feared is the same as being safe. But in organized crime, fear only protects you from external threats, not internal decisions. The real danger never comes from the streets. It comes from the structure above you deciding that your existence no longer benefits the system. And that is exactly what happened here. Tommy's execution was not an act of chaos. It was the completion of a process that had been slowly building for years. By the time he walked into that house, the outcome was already locked. The only thing left was execution of that outcome in a controlled environment where risk could be minimized and closure could be achieved without disruption. After his death, the world he once moved through continued without interruption. That is one of the most unsettling truths about organized crime narratives. People disappear, men are removed, and yet the system continues functioning as if nothing fundamental has changed. New enforcers replace old ones, new alliances form, and old stories slowly fade into rumor rather than documented history. Tommy DeSimone eventually became part of that fading process. His life, once filled with violence, ambition, and instability, was reduced to a cautionary example within a much larger system that never stops moving. The same system that once used him ultimately erased him without hesitation when the balance required it. And that brings the story back to the contrast that started it all, the contrast between cinematic storytelling and real-world structure. Goodfellas and similar portrayals focus on personality, dialogue, and dramatic moments. But the reality behind those stories is colder. It is built on systems, not scenes. On calculations, not emotions. On long-term control, not short-term reactions. Tommy DeSimone's real execution story is not brutal because of how it happened in that moment. It is brutal because of how ordinary it was within the system that allowed it. No chaos, no spectacle, no emotional closure. Just a decision carried out, and then silence. And in that silence, the real truth of organized crime becomes clear. Not everything ends with revenge. Some things simply end when they're no longer useful.